Huan Peng Lang. This is a term that is synonymous with the Straits Chinese of Penang. To know more about this, by Khok. Hello there, Huan Peng Lang. This is a term we don't often hear nowadays, but in the past, especially during my grandparents and my parents' generation, this is a term that was used by the Straits Chinese of Penang to identify ourselves. Often I would hear, Lang si Huan Peng Lang, Lang Lang si Teng Sua Lang. To know more about this term, let's have a chat with Dr. Churchman. Hi, Catherine. How are you?
Hi there, Jack. Lu hao bò. Đi chà ba bồi à? Chà ba leo.
Very good, Catherine. Thanks for joining us today. Today we are discussing the term Huan Peng Lang, and as I mentioned earlier, the term was used to describe ourselves, the Straits Chinese of Penang, but we don't often hear this term used anymore. This was used more during my grandparents' and my parents' generations. Perhaps you can start by telling us a bit about the origins of this term and how it relates to the Straits Chinese of Penang.
Right. Well, this idea of Huan, it was used originally in Hokkien to mean any kind of foreigner, anyone who's not Chinese. So Huan Bing is where the foreign people live originally. So that Bing is like Jip Bing, Hip Bing, they're there or here or there. Now the interesting thing about it is that so you have Huan Bing, and that's where the huana live, which is in ordinary Penang Hokkien. Now that's the Malay. Huana refers to Malays particularly. But if you go to other parts of the Hokkien speaking world, it means something different. So if you're in Manila and you say huana, it means Tagalog people, so the indigenous Filipinos. If you go to Amoy, huana actually means people like me. They don't use amo, they use they say huana. So I'm huana, and huana wa or huana ue, as they say there, means English. And I heard people say that about 15 years ago when I was there, people would say huana ue or huana wa for English. So and where else do they use it? In Indonesia as well, in Medan, it tends to mean the local Malays or local Indonesians as well. So anywhere where people speak Hokkien, it tended to mean the people who weren't Chinese, who they first came in contact with. Well, of course, if you're thinking about Amoy, it would have been all kinds of different people who they came in contact with over the years. In Taiwan, people don't use this term huana anymore because it was said to be insulting. And the Chinese character that people use for it, it originally, sometimes people would translate it as barbarian or savage, but actually when people first used that character, Huan, it just tended to mean anything foreign. And originally, it was referring to foreigners to the west of China, not outside, not down into the south or anywhere else, but it just got picked up in Hokkien and used like that. So it was a default term for foreigner, and instead of saying lam miao, like some of the newer arrivals in Penang say, people would say Huan Bing instead, and distinguish themselves from the Chinese. Who mentioned lam miao,
Catherine. When you mention lam miao, it means Nanyang, right? In English.
Yes, yeah, Nanyang. Right. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, similarly here, that lam miao, I mean, you're used Nanyang, people are used to thinking of that meaning meaning Southeast Asia, right? In Malaysia?
Right, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
but in New
Southeast
Zealand,
Asia is a whole, but Malaysia specifically. Yeah, when we as Malaysian state, to us, Nanyang would be, you know, Southeast Asia as a whole, but specifically Malaysia.
Yeah, well, here in New Zealand, the older generation of Chinese, the original generation of Chinese, who came here in the 1880s, 90s, all the way into the 1930s, they speak Cantonese or Sin Ning, and they use this term Lam Yeong as well, but they use it to mean New Zealand and Australia as well. So everywhere was classed as Lam Yeong or Nanyang, not just Malaysia. Yeah. So it had a very wide meaning, and same with huana. Huana had a very wide meaning in the past, and then as Hokkien broke up into sort of different groups where it didn't have a lot of contact with each other, then these meanings developed, the localized meanings developed, so it means something different in each place. But I found out something very interesting today, because I went looking for this, because I'd always wondered about how I knew that the word huana, it wasn't what I call an ancient word. So when I talk about ancient China, I'm talking about things that are 2,000 years ago or before the first emperor. That's what I mean when I say ancient. Sometimes you hear people say ancient and they just mean something like the 1700s or 1600s, but that's usually ancient and tends to mean like Roman and Greek. So it's kind of ancient China's that period. And I knew that they didn't use that term Huan or Fan, Fan in Mandarin or Fan in Cantonese. They didn't use it that far back. So it was something that was used probably in the 500s and 600s after that. And generally, I knew it started off being used for people in the West or to the west of China. So people like the Tibetans and Uyghurs and people like that. Now, what's really interesting about it is that I thought, they use this word tohuan in old Chinese texts, but they use it to refer to Tibet. So looking around for this, I thought maybe that Huan is actually the same ending, the same character, because sometimes they read that character bot or bo, the character Huan. I wonder if it had something to do with Tibet. And then I went to have a look a bit further, and I found there was actually a linguist who said people still argue about where this term Tufan or Tohuan for Tibet came from, or even how it was pronounced. But that last character is sometimes written the same as the Huan in Huana in Chinese. So one particular one linguist, a Tibetan linguist, said that word for Tibet that was used in the Tang dynasty got picked up and used as a general term for foreigner. So that word Huan, that came into Chinese then. And you can tell it came into Hokkien at the same time, because if you remember the talk I gave about the early Middle Chinese and late Middle Chinese, it's a late Middle Chinese borrowing, because that character would have originally been pronounced something like Ban or Bian. So then when I went looking a bit further, I found there was a linguist called, I've forgotten his name now, Peter Schreier, I think it was, and he was a linguist of Tibetan, and he said that the word derived from the old Tibetan religion, the Bon or the Bun, and it was borrowed into Tang Dynasty Chinese as the word for Tibetans, and then it became a general word for foreigner. So the word Bon and the word Huan as in Huana, they may actually have the same. If you look at the old pre-Buddhist religion of Tibet, that's called the Bon religion. So Bon and Huan may ultimately come from the same place. But then I found a whole bunch of linguists arguing over it, over exactly how the character is pronounced and whether it should be. Some people pronounce it Tubo and some people pronounce it Tufan. And there's a big argument about this. So that's quite interesting as well. So it's one of these words, and this happened in Chinese quite a bit, where you'd have a general term for foreigner, and it would get picked up and used in a wider as in a wider meaning. There was another term they used to use, "yi," which doesn't exist in Hokkien anymore. I don't think the term "yi," not in Penang Hokkien anyway. And that used to mean the people who lived in Shandong, that area. But then gradually it moved out further to the east, and it used to mean Koreans and Japanese. And then eventually it went all over the place, and it just became the general term for non-Chinese as well. And then it passed out of use, and then other people picked up different ways of saying it. So, yeah, it's a very long story, actually.
Well, I'm glad you gave us this long origin of the term Huan Peng Lang. So obviously, it is not a new term coined just for the Straits Chinese of Penang. As you mentioned, it has gone back, at least 1,000 over years. It came from 500, 600 AD. So it's not a new term. But how does it specifically relate to us here, the Straits Chinese of Penang, and why do we use it?
Well, I guess it was they used Huan Peng as in opposition to Deng Sua. So it means the foreign country rather than the old country. So sometimes you see Deng Sua when they do some Chinese dictionaries that have that in it. They'll say it means something like saying the old country. And so Huan Peng is the new country, right? It's the foreign country originally, but then people start using it for themselves because they were born and generations of them had lived there. So it ceased to be foreign for them, but they still use the old term, the foreign place, or the place of the foreigners.
I suppose, like what I mentioned earlier, we differentiate ourselves here, the ones who have lived here longer as Huan Peng Lang, and the ones who newly arrived, we don't really call them Sinkat in the past. We call them the Deng Sua Lang, actually.
Deng Sua Lang, yeah.
Sinkat is actually more of a new term, I mean, we normally call them Deng Sua Lang,
Deng Sua Lang.
I mean, they are newly arrived here, but they were from Deng Sua, as opposed to the Straits Chinese, who have been born and bred here for some time, for even generations.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to stop saying, because of that, I'm going to stop saying Sinkat and I'm going to just start saying Deng Sua Lang instead.
But then now if you say Deng Sua Lang, some people may misunderstand you and think that you're referring to the Chinese Chinese of China,
Oh, but like Tiongkok.
Yeah. Yes. But in the past, the Straits Chinese of Penang and the newly arrived will be living here together, but the Straits Chinese of Penang will still refer to the newly arrived as Deng Sua Lang.
Deng Sua Lang, yeah. I've heard the term, what's it, Deng Sua Ape? Is it like
Yes.
like the Chinese uncle?
Well, in these politically very sensitive times, with people being very woke and being culturally sensitive, culturally correct, politically correct, there are factions or there are people who object to the use of Huan Peng Lang now to be used to identify us. I mean, I personally, I've heard my grandparents use the term to describe themselves. My parents use the term to describe themselves. What do you think of this new philosophy of not using this term?
Well, there are words. I guess that people didn't like it because they had words like Swa Huan and that sort of thing as well. Which had a slightly derogatory meaning to them, but that Huan, it got in everywhere. If you want to, or is it just if you're saying Huan Peng, I don't see the problem with that. You're talking about a place there, and if you think that it's bad to use it about a place, then why do people still use it about potatoes? Like Huan.
I guess people do not really understand that perhaps Huan doesn't mean barbarians. The meaning of Huan is actually foreign, right?
Foreign.
Yes. So there's actually nothing derogatory about it.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing was that okay, in the time when people were using this, if they had a name for you, and you weren't just a Lang, if you were a Huana or a Huan Lang, then of course it differentiates you from Chinese. And in China in the past, they did have that way of looking down on people. But it's the first time I actually ever heard, I don't think in Penang, even 5 or 6 years ago, I ever heard anyone complaining about people saying Huana. It
Yes,
was,
this
it's
is
only,
a fairly new development, you know.
But I mean, it's also because they kind of judge it by, if people had never learnt to read Mandarin, then they wouldn't have cared and they wouldn't know. It would just be the word for Malay. It's just because they've started to compare their usage with what other people use, say in Taiwan or so on, where it did become a word that people didn't want to use anymore. But yeah, I knew Malay people themselves who spoke good Hokkien, and they would call it huana because it was just a neutral term. It's just picked up I mean, perhaps in the past it wasn't, and then it became a neutral term because people don't think about those sorts of things, and now people started to pick it up again. But there are other words that have huan in them. But what is it they used to say? I found a couple of other ones that I hadn't seen before, like Huan Zun, like the and that was the ships that brought in imported goods. It was the Huan Zun.
Yeah.
But I don't think it was. It may not have been used in Penang at all, but it was something that I read in a Chinese dictionary when I was looking for things today. But then the word for tomato, even in Mandarin, there are lots of things like this in Mandarin that people don't even think about. The word for tomato is fan jie, which is the huan gyo instead of the angmo. What's a tomato in Penang is angmo gyo. So it's a huan.
Yes.
It's a huan gyo. I just forgot the tone on the gyo. That's it. Huan gyo. So people say that still, and they still say the word hu shuo for nonsense as well, and that's really bad because hu people are like me. That's another word for angmo, is like hu, or for huan even, and then it's angmo. It's like saying like wa got lang angmo gong wa hu shuo is nonsense. So it's quite a geography term as well, but that's used all the time with people not even thinking about it. But I don't particularly get offended about that because it's just something that passed into the ordinary vocabulary. Yeah, I wonder where that is. I'm trying to think where people even picked up the knowledge that it wasn't such a good word from in Penang, because I'd never heard anyone complain before about it.
I think it's probably a reason due to, as you mentioned, greater exposure to Mandarin and perhaps even to the Taiwanese culture. Because as I understand, in Taiwan, it is very derogatory to call the natives huana, you know.
Huana, the indigenous Taiwanese. Yeah, you should.
That's right. Yes. So perhaps it is picked up from the Taiwanese practice.
Yeah, that may well be the case, actually. Yeah, but I mean, originally,
it's good that you mentioned this, because I think with greater understanding of the origins of the word and the fact that the word can mean so much more, and rather than just barbarian, it actually means foreign. Then perhaps people will not get so sensitive about the usage of it, and perhaps we can see a resurgence in the use of the word Huan Peng Lang, the term Huan Peng Lang. We describe ourselves, the Straits Chinese of Penang, as opposed to even Peranakan, which actually is a very, very new term. Whereas Huan Peng Lang is an original term, if I may say so, of how the Straits Chinese of Penang refer to ourselves.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I got really excited when I got called Huana. I thought, oh, great, I like that. I was really surprised at first as well, because I was used to the term angmo, or in Taiwan they say atoga. Atoga is like, means to do with the pointedness of my nose, but they call it tok, like tok me, that sort of thing. But I think it means something different. It was sort of yeah, I guess the problem is people often judge Penang Hokkien and Straits Chinese Hokkien. They judge it by another standard, a standard in a different language, and Taiwanese and Straits Chinese Hokkien, they're not really the same thing. They kind of are, but they kind of aren't. And because of that, people will often take words into their own language from from Taiwanese, maybe without thinking about it too much. But actually, a lot of the
very interesting topic.
Yeah.
I think gives me the idea that we will do a session on this sometime in the future where we can talk more about this.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, I think that's all the time we have for this session. It's great that you have given us the origins of the word, how it's used not just in Penang but also in the other regions around here, and also that perhaps we shouldn't be so politically sensitive about the term we use now.
I'd say that if people themselves don't mind using it about themselves, and lots of Malay speakers of Hokkien who speak beautiful Hokkien, they always used that, and that was just their ordinary word for it. So to change it just because Mandarin is different or Taiwanese is different, I don't see the need for it. But
thank you very much for your time, Catherine. I mean, you have given us in just few minutes a very good understanding of the background of the word, and perhaps we should use more of the term Huan Peng Lang moving forward. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks
I look forward to talking to you again.
Same here.
See you then, Catherine. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us. See you at the next session of Lai Khok.